This is a sewing tutorial for Lily Dress View B. It's a pinafore dress with pockets in the skirt. It has a centre back split with a button and loop. The bodice is fully lined, the skirt is unlined, and the bodice is fully bagged out. It's a really beautiful finish. This style is suitable for advanced beginners, which means you have some experience sewing garments. It's probably a bit tricky for a complete beginner. Just a warning there, if you have never sewn a garment, you'll probably find this challenging. Having said that, watch along and see if you think you can follow along. Here are the cut pieces. I've got the centre front and back skirt, so that's cut 2 on the fold. I have the side skirt, which is cut 1 pair. Next are the bodices, so that's the front bodice, which is cut 2 on the fold, and here's the back bodice, which is cut 2 pairs. Pocket bags, also cut 2 pairs, and that is the button loop. Okay, first thing we're going to do is prepare the skirt. So I'm checking to see where that centre front waist neck is, and now I'm checking to see where the necks are on the pockets. So it's important that I know which is the waist edge because I want to put the pockets in the right way up. Okay, so here I'm just showing you that you're going to sew in between the necks. We're going to sew in 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch. Then we're going to pivot, sew down until the next neck, then we're going to pivot again and sew back out to the edge. Just showing you the other side now. So we're starting at 1 neck, sewing in 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch, then we're sewing down to the other neck, pivoting and sewing back out to the edge with a back tack. Okay, and so here are the pocket bags sewn onto the front skirt. Next we need to cut on an angle right into that corner. So we want to cut really close to the stitch line so that the corners turn neatly. If you don't cut far enough, then when you turn it to the right side, it puckers a bit. So we need to get right in there. And so here I'm showing you a close-up of the diagonal cuts, and I'm going to overlock in between those cuts. Okay, I'm just showing you the overlocked seam allowance now. Now we're going to turn the pocket bag over so that the right side is up, and we're going to understitch that seam that we've just made. Understitching is just an edge stitch that's really close to the seam, and it catches the seam allowance underneath, and what that does is it just allows the fabric to roll towards the inside of the garment. So that's the pocket mouth that we're finishing here, and when we turn it, it'll roll really easily and neatly. And just showing you the other pocket now. So we're doing the same thing again. We're just going to understitch in between those nicks. So we don't want to go past those nicks, otherwise we won't be able to turn it neatly. So just in between the nicks. Okay, and now I'm going to turn the pocket bag in towards the wrong side of the skirt, the wrong side of the fabric. And you just have to sort of turn that corner. If you've made your cuts close enough to the stitch line, it should turn quite easily. And then I'm just going to press that pocket mouth nice and flat. So I'm giving you a close-up of the pocket mouth, and you'll see there are some sort of triangle shapes at the top and bottom of the pocket opening. And I've just given that a really good press, and that's what the right side of the skirt looks like. Okay, so now we're going to join the top and bottom pocket bag together. So right sides of the fabric together. We're going to sew a centimetre seam or 3/8 of an inch all around the curve of the pocket. And over to the machine. here I am sewing right round the pocket 1 centimetre. Just making sure that those to the top and the bottom pocket bag match around the curves. It's I probably should be using pins. It's quite, because the curve of the pocket bag is on the bias, it can sort of stretch and distort, so just be careful to make sure that they don't do that and they match up nicely. Okay, so that's 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch right around the curve of the pocket bag. And once you've done that, you can overlock that edge. And I've just stitched the top and bottom of the opening to secure the pocket bag down. We don't want it folding up and flapping around when we're closing the seam. Okay, these are the side skirt panels. There is a neck near the waist edge, and we're going to create the tunnel for the elastic. So if you just press the top edge in 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch, this next step is easier. So at the neck, we've folded it down, and we're just going to sew very close to the folded edge right along. And what should be left is a casing that is wide enough to fit the elastic, but not so wide that it's sort of a bit, we want it to be firm, the elastic to fit firmly inside. So if you just want to double check that the casing is the right side for your elastic. Okay, so those tunnels are done, and now we're going to thread the elastic. So I've had a look at the pattern or the spec file to find out what length to cut for my size. Okay, so we're just poking the elastic through. I'm using a safety pin to do that. And then we want to just catch the very edge before we thread all of the elastic through. So I've just stitched about 6mm away from the edge there, just to catch that elastic. And there's my safety pin coming out the other end, and I'm going to catch that end as well, just with a little stitch. And I'm just showing you at the machine doing that second stitch along the edge just to secure the elastic. Okay, and that's what the gathered top part of the side skirt looks like now. And I'm just going to quickly show you the other side, exactly the same, threading the elastic through, but catching it before you thread right through to the other end. Very important, otherwise you're going to lose your elastic and you'll have to start all over again. And once you've secured one end, you can go through and pull the elastic through, take out the safety pin, and then secure the other end just with a little stitch. Now we're going to put the right sides of the bodice together. So I've got the lining here. I'm just going to put right sides together and match the shoulders. And I'm going to sew a 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch seam. You can do the same with the outer. So right sides together and sew with a 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch seam at the shoulder. And just showing you at the machine. So the outer and the lining are the same pattern piece, and in my case it's the same fabric, so we're just doing the same thing twice. And once you've sewn those seams, you can then press those shoulder seams. Press the lining seams open and the outer seams towards the back. And once you've pressed those seams, we can now put right sides together. So we're going to flip those over, right sides together, and just line up that neckline. So we want to make sure that the centre back matches, the shoulder seams match, and that centre front neck matches along that neckline. we're going to sew a 1/4 of an inch seam or 6 millimeters. So just a small bagging out seam around the neckline. Children's wear, especially the smaller sizes, those curves get very small, so it's nice to have just a small seam. It's much easier to turn. If you've got quite compact fabric, you may want to just clip into those corners a little bit. That can help before you do the next step, which is understitching. That can just help ease around those tight curves. So to do the understitching, I'm just folding the lining over the stitch line, and I'm going to edge stitch quite close to the seam on the lining side, and I'm catching the seam allowance underneath. And what this understitch does is just helps the lining roll towards the inside of the garment. It gives you a really nice, neat finish, and it's much easier to press. And just showing you how it looks on the wrong side, and just a bit of a close-up here of the understitching. And what we can do now is press that neck edge. And the next thing we're going to do is prepare the button loop. So with right sides together, I'm going to sew a 5mm seam, or a little bit less than a 1/4 of an inch. Then I'm going to just trim that seam allowance back a bit so that it turns much more easily. And I've cut into the folded side of that button loop, and I'm going to use a hairpin. I'm just going to poke that hairpin down inside the tube and turn the loop to the right side. So you see as the hairpin comes out the other end, the right side comes with it. Can be a bit fiddly to start, but once you get going, it's quite easy. And next we're just going to trim that loop back to 5 centimeters or 2 inches. And folding that loop in half, we're just going to line it up with the centre back edge, and that's on the left hand side of the garment. So right underneath that seam, and then just do a little stitch approximately 1/4 of an inch or 6 millimeters in from the edge. Now what I'm doing here is just clipping into the neck seam allowance. That will just help when you come to press that neckline nice and flat. And the next thing we're going to do is turn the garment so that right sides are together, and we will be sewing up the armhole side of the bodice 1 centimetre. Now we're going to start and stop at the necks, which are close to the waist edge on the back and the front. So where I'm putting those pins in, that's where the necks are, and we're going to sew 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance in between those pins. So just showing you at the machine, and just make sure that the shoulder seams match and that you're stopping and starting right at those necks. Okay, so I've sewn those armhole seams, and now I'm going to turn the garment to the right side. So I'm just poking the back bodice through the shoulder cavity and pulling it through. And you can see that both the neckline and the armhole edge are now nicely bagged out into the bodice. And at this stage you can give the neckline and the armhole a nice press. As you can see, I didn't. And now we're going to close up the centre back seam. So I've put right sides of the outer bodice together at the centre back, and there's a nick about a third of the way up, and I'm going to sew down from the nick to the waist edge. You can see that I've just done a 1 centimetre seam there, and now I'm doing the lining of the back bodice. So from the neck down to the waist edge with a 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch seam. So I've done that on both the lining and the outer, and now I'm putting the garment back to the right side. What you'll see here is a split at the top of the back bodice, and we're going to bag that out. So that means just putting the right sides back together, and the base of the split is that neck. So we're going to sew up from the neck right to the neck edge, and just showing you at the sewing machine. So that is the base of the split there that I'm starting at, and I'm sewing right up to the neck edge, and that's a 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch seam. Now I'm going to reach up inside to turn the garment to the right side. Just poke that corner through. And you can see that that's 1/2 of the split is nicely bagged out. Now we're going to do the other side. So you reach up inside the garment, pull it out so that right sides are together. And you want to sew from the neck up to the neck edge, or from the neck edge up to the neck. Either way is fine. And it's a 1 centimetre seam or 3/8 of an inch. And again, we need to turn the garment to the right side, so you reach up into it and put your thumb into the corner, and then just turn it to the right side. And you can see that that bodice is really taking shape now. And then there's a nice bagged out split at the back. Okay, and I've just given that split a nice press, and I've pressed the centre back seam open. This is the front skirt that we've already put the pockets, sewn the pockets into. We want to sew a gathering stitch along the waist edge, and that's about 1/4 of an inch or 6 mil down from the edge. Now we're going to match up the centre front neck. There's a neck in the middle of the skirt panel and a neck in the middle of the bodice panel. And we're just gathering the skirt to fit the bodice. And so that's the waist seam that we're about to sew with a 1 centimetre seam or 3/8 of an inch. Over to the machine. And my first centimetre to 1.5 centimetres, or what's that, about 3/8 of an inch to 1/2 an inch-ish. You don't want any gather because that's going to be your seam allowance. So you start the gather just in from the edge. I'm using my little snips just to help squash down those gathers and prevent the presser foot from pushing those gathers out. Just trying to get a really even gather there. Okay, so that front waist seam is now sewn, and we can flip over the skirt and press that waist seam up towards the shoulder. Now we're going to attach the centre back skirt onto the back bodice. So again, we're looking for that waist neck. We've done a gathering stitch, which is just a long stitch, about 1/4 of an inch or 6 mil down from the waist edge, and we're gathering to fit. Again, sewing with a 1 centimetre seam or a 3/8 of an inch seam. Trying to get really nice even gather. Some people do 2 rows of gathering stitch. I just find 1 row of stitching is fine. It's up to you. It's no right or wrong. Okay, so that's the back skirt sewn to the back bodice. Again, we're just going to press that waist seam upwards. And so what's missing from this dress now is the side panels. So with right sides together, we're going to get one of the side skirt panels and join it to the front skirt. So the top of the elastic should meet the neck on the bodice and the hems should meet. We're going to sew a 1 centimetre seam or 3/8 of an inch. So you can see that the elastic is right up against that neck on the bodice. And so the top edge of the elastic should meet the neck on the bodice, and the bottom edge of the elastic should meet the waist seam. So just sewing down with a 1 centimetre seam, which is 3/8 of an inch. Now I'm getting to where the pocket mouth starts. So I've just done a little back tack just to give it some extra strength, and I'm sort of moving the pocket mouth out of the way as I continue to sew that 1 centimetre seam. And do another little back tack as I get to the bottom of the pocket mouth. And then just continue down to the hem. So that's the seam sewn there, and that's what it looks like on the front. And there's the pocket. So I'm going to, this is the back skirt, which I'm now joining to that same side skirt panel. Top of the elastic meets with the neck, and the hems should meet at the bottom. So again, just a 1 centimetre seam or 3/8 of an inch, and there's no pocket to sew past this time, so this is a bit quicker. And sew right up to the neck on that bodice. Then you can go ahead and overlock those side seams, and you can see how that side panel is joined to both the front and the back. Okay, I have been over to the iron and just pressed the lining up the waist edge 1 centimetre. And now I have pinned the lining down, and I'm sandwiching the elastic in between the lining and the outer. So I've got right sides together, and I'm just going to sew a continuation of the seam that's already there, 1 centimetre, just along the depth of the elastic there. So over at the machine, starting at the top of the elastic, which is the neck on the bodice, I'm sewing through the lining and the outer and the elastic all together. The elastic is sandwiched in between, and that's just going to bag out the end of the elastic into the bodice. And just showing you the other side. So again, that waist edge is, I've just ironed it up 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch. Okay, so here you can see just how neatly everything is bagged out into that bodice. And now we can join the other side skirt. So exactly the same as before. The top of the elastic meets the neck on the bodice. The bottom of the elastic lines up with the waist seam. And I'm going to sew a 1 centimetre seam or 3/8 of an inch all the way down. Okay, and now I'm going to join it to the front, also with a 1 centimetre seam. And I'm going to take care when I sew past the pocket, do a little back tack at the top and bottom of the opening, and I'm going to be very careful not to sew through the pocket mouth where it shouldn't be, in between the necks. Okay, and I'm up to the elastic now. And while I'm here, I can actually do this step straight away. So I've just pulled the lining down over the elastic, and I'm just finishing off that seam, and then I can overlock that that side seam later. So here is the other side. And now I'm going to overlock those seams. Right, so the garment's actually almost finished. You can see it looks pretty neat. Now we just need to sew the lining down at the waist edge. So I'm turning the garment to the right side, and I'm going to going to use a technique called stitching the ditch. So we're going to sew right underneath the waist seam, and we're going to catch the lining underneath. We're only going to catch it by about 2 millimeters, roughly 1/8 of an inch. So it's very, very tiny, but it's a really beautiful professional finish. So I'm just checking to see that my pins have caught the lining underneath, which it has. And I'm just showing you I'm going to stitch right underneath that waist seam. Just being careful not to wobble and sew onto the bodice. I'm really sewing just underneath that seam. So it's, especially in this fabric, it's invisible. In a plain fabric, it's almost invisible. Okay, and just back tacking at the other end. Right, so I'm pinning the back now. I'm doing the same thing. I'm using my fingers underneath to feel the pin as I pin through. So I only really want to catch a couple of millimeters or 1/8 of an inch. And I'm going to stitch right underneath that seam. So I'm going pretty carefully, and I'm sort of feeling underneath the seam as I go, just to make sure that that lining is being caught. Okay, while I'm here, I'm quickly going to do the hem. You can go over to the iron and press the hem edge up 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch, but I'm too lazy. I'm just using a really long plain stitch, and I'm sewing the edge up 1 centimeter, and then I'm going to fold that edge up 2.5 centimeters or 1 inch. And I'm just using the guidelines on my sewing machine instead of measuring, and that's just much faster. I will now remove that long stitch that I did in the first place and press that hem nice and flat. And we're really almost finished now, just putting on the button. And I'm going to leave a little gap between the button and the fabric, and there I was just wrapping the thread around between the button, and that gives that little shank, which is, when you've got a loop, you want a bit of a gap for the fabric to sit underneath the button. Okay, and just a close-up of that stitching the ditch there, and how it's caught the lining underneath quite neatly. And I really like the finishing with this style. It's also quite a good style if you don't have an overlocker. You could just leave off the pockets and do French seams for those side panel seams. Okay, and a nicely bagged out back split there, and pockets if you want them, and you're done. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial.